Do you want to create an art journal or mixed media piece that has that vintage vibe? Well, look no further because in this video, I'm going to give you some tips and tricks and things to consider if you want to go vintage. Hi, I'm Creative Katie, Karen Burchill. Welcome to my studio. So the first thing you want to do when you're going vintage is pick vintage colors. So if you do a search online, you're going to get Prussian blues, navies, dark reds, burgundies, deep gold, things along that line, muted colors. And so I was inspired by this rice paper, the red that was on here, the navy/Prussian blue, and there is some gold on there. So that pointed me in the direction. Now, there's more to a vintage page than simply the colors. What you want to do is think about Victorian eras, the flocked wallpapers, the tapestries. And so I want to build in texture. So I grabbed a bunch of my gel prints that fall into that color scheme and I'm ripping them up and then I'm going to use some of them, not all of them, on there. I want papers that are crinkled that have that texture. And by layering it in, as you're going to see as I start gluing this down, you're going to see how I built in that texture, that old, give it that vintage feel. So we've got the colors and we've got the layering, the crinkledness, what do you think of when you think Victorian and vintage? I've got rice paper, I've got mulberry paper here, there's paper that's on phone book sheets, different textures at every one of those. And I'm ripping it because I want it to, again, look older and more vintage. So I'm layering this up and using collage to set the background. I struggle because I'm trying to make a page. This is simply a background. I've got my color scheme and I'm building the colors and the textures. And I should be happy with that, but I'm trying to make a composition here. I'm not sure. Some or all of this, some of this may not even show in the end, and that's okay because the purpose will be achieved. Now I'm going to glue this down and I am using my fluid matte medium. And I'm again, to build that texture, layering it up in an interesting pattern. And I've got those colors. So when you look at these colors, are you thinking vintage? Is that where you're going? Maybe yes, maybe no. We all have our own thoughts on what makes something vintage. And I'm just sharing mine in here. So here's that layering up, the rippedness. This is going to make for a fairly dark background. You can use book paper. Love that navy mulberry paper. Great way to use the things that are in your stash as well. You could use scrapbook papers in that. So once the background is completely dry, I'm just flipping it over and cutting off the excess. Now, the next step to creating vintage is putting some patterns. What do you think of when you think vintage? Weather vanes, postmark, scripts, clocks. So look through your stamps and see what in your mind goes with vintage. So that's what I have here. I've got some clocks and some other markings that for me go with vintage. And I'm grunging this up. Again, that's part of vintage. It's not going to be bright, clear colors. It's going to be muted on the dark side. Here I've got some script. Again, this is the markings resemble. It's like Old English script or markings. And again, I'm not looking for a perfect stamped image. This is just adding vintage patterning to this. But when I think vintage, I also think script. So you're going to see me use some script stamps on here as well. This stencil from the Crafter's Workshop is called Linked Tiles, and it, for me, has a very vintage vibe. And I'm stenciling on with black acrylic paint. Kind of wishing that I hadn't done the black. It looked a little dark, but it goes with the vintage thing. So I'm putting that pattern on there. Again, that's reminding me of the wallpapers, the tapestry. We've got lots of layers. Another stencil that goes with the vintage vibe is this Harlequin stencil. To me, it's just that goes together. When I think vintage, this is what I will grab. Now I'm stenciling on this one with my lighter version of Naples yellow. And right now I really like it as I'm looking at this video. But at the time it was like, oh, that was a mistake. So you're not going to see a lot of this, but you definitely are going to get that layered look with all the details. So that's completely dry. And then at this point, I'm looking at it thinking, am I done? And I'm unsure if I'm happy with it. So I edge my page. I take a minute, step back, I frame it by the black edging that I'm doing, and then I make an assessment. Am I done or can I do more? And what is the more that I'm going to do? Some of that Harlequin stenciling, I thought I overdid it. So I'm taking my Prussian blue paint and knocking that back. And then I'm adding a little bit more of the red. I've lost some of that colors with the layers that I put in there. So now I'm simply adding it back. If you're not happy, do something else. You can knock it back or bring something out depending on. And you think, well, you just reworked it. Why did you do that? Well, it's definitely given me that layered, more vintage look. And then I've decided, I said, for me, adding some script in, written letters, vintage, old English, and just adding a little bit of script here with white acrylic paint. I chose white here because the background's fairly dark, and I just wanted to add a little bit of brightness from behind. And then I'm using the lid of a glue container or glue stick, and I'm adding some circles. Now, I'm not 100% sure that this falls into the vintage category. It brightened the page, which is why I went with it. But I don't know if I can sell it or as a vintage edition. So I'm kind of grunging this up, kind of double stamping it to make it look less pristine, a little bit more, I'm not sure, trying to make it more vintage. And then I'm adding a little bit of that deep gold color. This is yellow oxide, and I'm just adding that to the background. And again, that's one of the vintage colors, that rich gold that goes with the Prussian blue and the deep reds. You don't see it, so it's not a pattern that's like in your face, but it definitely adds to the page. Then you're going to want to source vintage focals. This one comes from the blog, The Old Design Shop. She's got tons of vintage focal images that you could use in your art journal page. So go check her out. So I found this Victorian lady, and I just cut it out, printed it on copy paper, cut it out, and I'm going to glue it down onto my vintage background. So it kind of looks like it's wallpaper, um, minus my little circles there. I'm giving it a coat of fluid matte medium underneath and on top. And now I'm painting her dress that um, yellow oxide color. I don't want to introduce another color. I thought the navy was going to be, or Prussian blue was going to be too dark, the red again, but I thought the gold, very vintage. I do go in and I do some shading I add a little bit of the alizarin crimson on the dress just to bring some of that color from the background onto her dress. By sealing it with the fluid matte medium, it just makes it easier to paint it right now. Then I'm just giving her some hairdo, coloring her hair. I didn't want to go gold or blonde. I kind of go back and forth and add a little bit of black and some shadings coming up. But I don't think all of that's caught on video because it's a lengthy process and I want to give you the steps that I follow, but you don't need to see me do something for 30 minutes. And here I'm shading around the dress, the focal image. I want that dress to pop up from the background. I'm adding some shadows. So what do you think of the background? Did I hit the mark and create vintage? Let me know in the comment section below. So I'm shading around to make her pop off the background, and then I do some shading on her dress as well. And I think the shading really makes it stand out. And then I put a sentiment going, making your eyes slow down. This is from my Sassy Sayings sentiment pack, and it's definitely not vintage, but I like that kind of tongue in cheek. I was going with people's acts say I act like I don't care, or I agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong. So I thought that was kind of a play on words. We got our Victorian prim and proper, and I have her basically saying, you know, something that's not necessarily Victorian. And by my placement on here, I've kind of knocked back some of those bubbles because I was thinking maybe that's not so vintage. But the white of the bubbles really goes well with the sentiment in my mind. Then I grab my charcoal pencil, which is um, another way of making it look a little bit more vintage, a little more grunge, because you get that softer shading, not as bright and modern looking. The other thing to add vintage here, I talked about texture. I think if I was doing this again, that stenciling I did with the link tiles, I would do that with modeling paste and added that texture so the background really looked like those flocked wallpapers, tapestries. So thank you so much for joining me. I hope you got some tips. I hope you have fun creating some vintage pages all your own. I just wanted to add a little bling here. I'm using my fine line applicator with gold paint. I'm just going around my sentiment. And this gold around here ties into her dress, ties into the gold that's in the background. A little bit of detail. Until next time, go get creative.